Heart of Dogman.
Welcome to Scary Stories, the channel that tells you scary stories.
Best of Dogman Part 2. Over an hour of our most terrifying Dogman tales, followed by a brand new story nobody has ever heard before.
Is the Wisconsin Wolfman from space?
As told to Peter Bernard.
Read by Madeline Starr. I was never interested in monsters or weird stuff, but now I have a 12-year-old son, and monsters are all he can talk about. One night at dinner, he was telling me about a monster he read about that lives in Wisconsin. He asked me, didn't I used to live in Wisconsin? Of course, he knew that I had, so I asked him what the monster was. When he said it was a dogman, I dropped my fork onto my plate loudly and scared the crap out of our cat. I had nearly forgotten the story, but when he said that, it all came back in a rush, and I told him my story from back in the early 1990s. He insisted I had to pass it on to others, so for the sake of my son, here is the story of the craziest thing that ever happened to me. Okay, it was either 1991 or 1992, and I was driving home from a concert. Yes, it was grunge. I was in college, and that's what I liked. Don't ask me what bands we saw that night, but it would have been local bands. It was a show at a local bar that my friends hung out at. So I was driving home alone, and the road I was taking cut through the forested area over there. There were no streetlights, but everything seemed lit up, almost like daytime. After a while, I started to wonder where all the ambient light was coming from, and then I saw it. Some huge something lit up all bright in the sky, moved out into my field of vision through my front windshield. It must have been directly above me up until that moment. Even at that time, I thought it was odd I didn't feel panicked by this. It moved out further in front, and I remember thinking, are you following me, or am I following you? And in my head, I heard the response. We all follow the same lead. It felt like someone talking to me in my brain, but it also felt like me talking to myself, and I still felt totally relaxed and fine with all of this. I saw the light move away and seemed to land somewhere in the forest off to my right. Everything got much darker after it left. There was no moon out that night or streetlights on that stretch of highway. I wonder where my friend has gone, I thought, then realized I had said it out loud. I got wrapped up in thought, wondering why I had referred to that light in the sky as a friend. And I'm afraid I wasn't really paying as much attention to the road as I should have been when the creature jumped out onto the road from right in front of me. I was barely able to swerve out of the way in time. My car entered into a spin, and everything seemed to be occurring in extra slow motion as the car spun around to face the thing again. I could see it was very tall, very broad-chested, and stood like a man. But it was not a man. It had a dog's head, or a wolf's head, a coyote head. I'm not sure. It was a tall, hairy man with a dog's head. His legs were bent backwards like a dog's legs, or like the devil's. The car, still in slow motion, spun around so that I was facing away from the monster, then back again to where he was. And I could see him run off the road, still on his hind legs, and off into the forest where I could see him no longer. The car spun around, so I was once again facing the direction I wanted to go in, and somehow I miraculously hit the gas pedal at the exact right moment, and sped off down the highway as though nothing at all had happened. As calm as I had felt during the sighting of the strange light, that's how terrified I was after seeing the wolf man or dog man or whatever that thing was. For the rest of the way home, I was convinced I was being watched. I never sped so fast or drove so dangerously in my life, before or since. When I got home, I ran into the house so fast that I didn't realize till the next day I had left my car door unlocked. Fortunately, nobody else realized either, and all my stuff was intact as I had left it. I had no explanation for either part of the story, and I can't tell you for certain that the first part is related in any way to the second part. All I know is I saw a strange light. Then a few minutes later, I saw a strange creature. I don't know if that thing came from the light, or if the light spooked him and made him exit the forest. To be honest, I can't be sure I didn't imagine the entire episode. I mean, what evidence can I produce that it even happened? All I know is I moved out of Wisconsin the next month, and I've been quite happy here in New York City for all that time since then. We've got a lot of crazy things here in the Big Apple. But as far as I know, we don't have any werewolves.
When I was a kid, I saw what people now call Dogman out in the forest past the fields behind my junior high school. And although I did not see him come out of a hole in the ground, I'm going to tell you a story about why I think Dogman is a guardian of the Underworld. As told to Peter Bernard, read by P.Q. Ribber. This story happened about 1996 or 97, when I was, I guess, 14 or 15 years old. Our school was situated next to two baseball field-sized meadows that a lot of us boys and some of the girls would use to play baseball, soccer, football, or sometimes less organized games after school. One time a couple of my friends joined in with the Star Wars Club, playing some sort of touch tag Star Wars hide-and-seek style game. I got killed, so I had to stay on the ground. I chose to give my all to the role and performed a death scene as melodramatically as I could manage at that age, totally Shatnering it up. Then I moaned, "Goodbye, cool world," as I lay my head down on the grass, readying myself for the big sleep. After lying there for a few seconds, my friends just looking at me, I lifted my head and quickly spat out, "He's dead, Jim," before once again resuming my immortal slumber. They all quickly returned to the game without even applauding my landmark performance, leaving me there on the ground alone. Listening. Listening to what? I realized I was hearing a sound I didn't recognize when I had my ear to the ground. Was it coming from the air? No. Was it coming from inside my head? Maybe. No, well, probably not. So then it must be coming from underground? It sounded like a vibration, but not a steady one. It would rise, and it would fall, and every so often, timed in with the vibration, there would be what felt like the fall of something incredibly heavy. So heavy that my entire body would shake each time it fell, which wasn't very often. The vibrations took their time and looped over and over and over again hypnotically. Soon I had forgotten all about the game, my friends, and this world. Soon my entire consciousness was filled with wonder about what possibly could be making this happen underneath me. All I could envision would be some kind of machine from one of the old Fleischer Brothers Superman cartoons from 1940, but bigger and underground in a huge cavern. Whack. Wham. Ouch. Whack. Wham. Ouch. Whack. Ouch. Someone had kicked me, literally in the butt, and I turned around angry and scared, afraid of who it might be. Do you want to go home, or do you want me to read you a bedtime story? My brother asked. I told you not to kick me without warning first, you dunce, I shouted back. I really had told him not to do that because it happened usually 2 or 3 times a month at unpredictable moments, and I really was beyond sick of it. All I wanted was a warning. It's not like I was asking him to stop. I told him to listen to what I had been listening to, but he thought I was just trying to get him down on the ground so I could kick him back. After a bit of arguing, I gave up and we went home. But I kept talking to him about it through homework. Then I told our parents at dinner. Then I kept talking to my brother about it after dinner, past more homework, through when he was trying to watch ER. By next morning, when I was still talking about it, my brother said he would listen for himself after school. But if I don't hear anything, I'll see to it that your ears are left ringing for a long time, he told me, adding his own clause to the deal without consulting me about it first. My ears were left untouched, as first my brother, then his friends, then my friends, then all the kids laid down on the grass in the meadow with one ear to the ground, listening and wondering. We all sat around, then trading theories about what it might be. Someone mentioned Richard Shaver, who the rest of us had never heard of. He was some guy who claimed voices spoke to him through machine vibrations and told him about these big machines underground, operated by slaves ruled over by evil robots. This was Friday, so some of us decided to regroup on the spot the next day around noon and take a trek into the forest just past the field in search of some entrance that might give us a clue as to what was causing the underground vibrations. I think 7 of us actually showed up the next day, and off into the forest we went. My brother brought his old-school 35mm camera with him, but other than that, we were equipped with nothing in the way of recording or defense equipment. We also had neglected to remember to bring food or water, and the latter came into play early, as that day qualified as its own mini Indian summer. We did, however, have a metal detector. It was old even then, and it belonged to my Uncle Arthur, but he had lent it to my dad 7 or 8 years ago, so we took it with us without asking permission. Who were we supposed to ask, Uncle Arthur? He'd moved south to San Francisco. So we had this thing that looked like an electrified golf club mixed with a pogo stick to me at the time, and it bleeped and blooped when we held it over bottle caps and other metallic debris which we dug out of the grounds using our hands. We speculated over each piece of garbage, wondering if it might be a clue about what was happening beneath our feet. We had wandered deeper and deeper into the forest, and I was getting pretty thirsty. It got so bad that I ripped a Y-shaped twig off a tree and tried to see if I had any dowsing abilities, more interested at that point in finding drinkable water than whatever else might be going on underground. I was broken out of my self-pity when my brother cried out that he had found something. Running over, I could hear the metal detector going off. My brother had found a round metal grating on the ground, which appeared to be attached to the top of a pipe that led straight down into the ground. We had been walking into the forest for hours and had seen absolutely no above-ground structures of any kind the entire time. So where exactly did this pipe go down to? My friends looked pretty surprised. Sometimes, even when you know something must be true, finding out it really is true can be a bit of a shock. My brother took a picture or two of the grating, and even then, we knew nobody would understand the significance of the photo, and maybe they wouldn't even believe us. I knelt down and put my ear to the grating to listen. I wasn't sure I heard or felt anything, but my friends were all talking excitedly amongst themselves. I shushed them and tried again. This time I thought I heard something, but not the same sound as before. This time it sounded like squishing and clicking. That's the best I can describe it, squishing and clicking. But no deep vibrations like before, as I had been expecting. I lifted my head to give my friends the result when one of the girls screamed. She was looking at my right ear and screaming. Then my brother was holding me and doing something to the side of my face, quickly. "Don't move," he said. Then, "Got it. Emergency over. Long live Jambi." I glanced around, trying to figure out what had just happened. Everyone looked grossed out, but that was all I knew. "What was it? What was on my face?" I asked, looking from one friend to another, as each avoided eye contact with me. From behind, I heard my brother doing something to the metal grating. He was unscrewing it. We all watched as he pulled the cover off the pipe, and dozens of roach-sized, white, multi-legged insects swarmed out onto the grass in all directions. They seemed like as if God made insects without the exoskeleton. They were all soft white underbelly and legs, and they all appeared wet and slimy as well. "Oh, so that's what was on me," I said, stunned. "That's the thing Mr. Rourke put in Chekhov's ear." I was convinced that this must be some species from deep under the ground that accidentally made its way up to the surface. How else to explain its pure white color and lack of exoskeleton? Then one of the girls explained the meaning of the word larvae to me, because she thought she was so smart. I know what you're thinking. Where's Dogman? I don't remember seeing larva in the title. I remember seeing Dogman. Well, okay, so suddenly Dogman was right there. That's what it was like. We were talking about the stages of insects' life development, and then suddenly Dogman is there. We all discussed this moment in time for hours on multiple occasions afterward, and we all agreed that none of us noticed where he came from. Two of us thought he emerged from behind a bush, but that was as specific as they got. None of us saw him materialize or anything weird like that. I heard him first. Deep growl, or snarling kind of sound. My brother and some of the others said they first noticed or felt someone was watching them, then looked around and saw the Dogman there. I should also point out that back then we called it a wolfman or werewolf. We also had an ongoing discussion about whether it could have been a Bigfoot that we somehow were confused into thinking had a dog's head. But my brother and I both noticed it had legs more like a deer or a dog, not like a human's legs at all. One of the girls was religious, and she thought it was the devil or a demon, but it did not have cloven hoofs. It had feet like a dog or wolf, but with the hugest claws I'd ever seen on any animal outside of the bears at the zoo. All of these perceptions were gathered in a few seconds, wherein we all stood there, looking at the Dogman, and it stood there, looking at us, growling deeply and quietly, and baring its teeth at us. I noticed how much taller than us it was, and I thought about how if that thing wanted to, it could tear each of us apart, one at a time. I thought it was a good thing the creature didn't want to do that. Then it sprang at us. I remember it moved so fast that a trail of spit flew straight back out of both sides of its mouth before I even began to turn to run away. Each of us recall entirely different things from this point in the story on, but we ran. I ran, then hid to catch my breath, then ran, then hid for about 45 minutes. I remember distinctly looking back and seeing the Dogman approaching each time I took a rest, every single time. The others say they gave up running after a while because the Dogman wasn't behind them anymore, and so they walked the rest of the way. We got separated early on, but we all knew to follow the setting sun west to get back to the town, so we all made it out alive. I exited the forest along the highway, probably a quarter-mile south of the school meadows. That meant I would have to walk along the highway with cars whizzing past for quite a ways in order to get back to civilization. I eagerly jumped to the task, happy to be out of the woods. I was desperate for water and panting from overexertion, but I knew I could make it home in a half hour or so, and my spirits were definitely lifting. The traffic was coming from behind me, so I was walking with my neck twisted a bit to the left, away from the forest to my right, watching for oncoming vehicles. This paid off quickly when some young bullies deliberately drove too close to me and sprayed me with gravel from the side of the highway. A few of the stones were very painful when they hit me, and I was gagging on the dust, but at least I got out of the way in time to avoid being hit. Now, I had the most serious case of dry mouth ever, and I was bent over, coughing and wheezing. That's when a middle-aged, balding, sort of creepy-looking guy screeched to a halt to my left and started shouting at me to get into his car. I tried to say something to him, but found that I could not speak. He insisted I get in the car, and I grew frightened. I knew about stranger danger as well as the next kid, but this was the first time I felt like that sort of thing might be happening to me. I took a step or two back from the car. The driver slid over and opened his door, terrifying me. He looked furious and screamed at me, "For God's sake, look behind you! For God's sake, look behind you!" I did as he suggested, and all time slowed to a standstill. There it was. The Dogman was right there, maybe 90 feet from me, now 80, now 70. It was on all fours, but it was still taller than I was, and it was running toward me, faster than I'd ever seen anything non-motorized move in my life. I don't even remember turning around and getting in the car. I only remember us driving away and the Dogman chasing us. It paced us as we sped up to 30, 40, 50 miles an hour. The driver sped up to 90 and the creature started receding into the background a bit. By then I noticed we had just passed the school grounds and I wanted to get out but still couldn't speak. The driver had a box of water bottles in the back seat which he offered me. I forget how many I drank, as I gave him a corner 2 blocks from my house to drop me off at. He wanted to come talk to my parents about what happened, but my parents were the last people who I wanted to tell this story to. I wasn't sure how, but I was pretty certain it would get me and my brother in trouble. So all of us kids considered ourselves lucky that we got out of the situation alive with none of our parents finding out. None of us wanted to go exploring in those woods again, and we all left the meadow a bit earlier than we used to from then on. It became accepted knowledge that the entrance to hell was in the forest behind the school, and that it was guarded by a werewolf. It became a running joke that this was where the school got our teachers from. We never saw Dogman again, but on the day I went away to college, I took a trip down to the school to listen to the ground one more time. The vibration was still there, same as before. I wondered what it could be. I tried one more time to visualize what could possibly make sounds like that and what it was doing under the junior high school. Then I could swear I could hear shouting, like men shouting at each other. Men having an argument somewhere deep underground, reverberating all the way up here to the surface. To this day, before I set up a campsite or purchase a property, I bend down and listen to the ground to hear if anyone is having an argument down there. Years passed, and both my parents moved to the East Coast. My brother moved down to Los Angeles, and I ended up in Austin. When I first noticed Google Maps a few years ago, I was most interested in viewing aerial photography of that particular patch of woods, only to find that the entire area had been paved over and turned into a giant shopping mall and parking lot. Well, I can't be sure the area with the grading that we found is paved over, since we didn't exactly have GPS with us that day when we went on our little adventure. But a large part of the forest is now gone, and the parking lot extends all the way over to the meadows behind the school, which now no longer exist. Someday before I die, I want to travel back to that town I grew up in, and I want to bend down, and I want to listen to the ground in that parking lot. I want to know if the underground people moved away when the mall moved in, or if they decided that it served as a better distraction than sending a wolf man out to chase kids down the highway. These days, when I see things on the internet discussing Dogman as though he were an animal like a bear or a moose, I disagree intensely. To me, the Dogman could not possibly be an ordinary creature. Ordinary creatures can't chase a car going 50 or 60 miles per hour down the highway. No, the Dogman is a guardian of the machines of the underworld. The Dogman is a creature from hell. Savage Night of the Man-Beast, as told to Peter Bernard, read by P.Q. Ribber. I'm going to tell you a story you won't believe, and I wouldn't believe it either if you told it to me. I'm going to tell you a tale about a werewolf or wolfman or dogman or skinwalker or something that stalked me, hunted me, terrorized me, and tried to end my life. But first I need to explain a couple things. This is a story about me as a young man. I'm not this way anymore, but I can't deny how I was back then. I'm not proud of a lot of that, but it's not like I did any of this by conscious choice. I was an animal following instincts. That's also why I'm in no place to judge the actions of the vicious man-beast who nearly killed me. We were both merely following our biological imperative. The reason I met that monster had to do with this woman I met at a party I crashed on the edge of town. She was the curviest girl at the party and also had the prettiest face. In those days, I usually ran into one kind or the other, but this girl was everything all at once. Judging by her clothes, she had come directly from work, and her work was something in an office. Her clothes were flattering, but clearly a bit worn, so she was more likely in the typing pool than in management. I don't remember what she said, but I remember watching her full and perfect lips moving, so she must have been saying something. And I must have said something back, because I was soon leaving that party and taking the hottest girl in the room with me on my arm. Out in my car, I started the engine and drove in the opposite direction of her neighborhood. Don't try this at home, kids. I was an expert at the time. I drove to a lover's lane I knew of nearby that had seemed secluded the last few times I'd taken girls there. This time, however, when we arrived, there were already 3 couples parked there. So I kept driving. And driving. And driving. After a while, I had no idea where we were, but it was dark and it was secluded. There were no street lights, and I hadn't seen another car for a few minutes. "Oh no, do you hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" she answered back. "The engine. It's making a noise. I'd better pull over." I pretended to mansplain while pulling off the 2-lane road and parking in the utter darkness of the dirt alongside. The only lighting came from the dashboard. I put in my seduction cassette, and I want to say maybe Barry White or something like that would have started playing. I was smooth, but I was also obvious. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Don't you have to get out of the car and check the engine?" That's when our entire world began to rock, and to roll, and to spin, around and around and around as my car tilted sideways to the right off the edge of the sheer incline I had unwittingly parked next to in the dark. We tumbled down, spinning over and over and over. Each time we were upside down, our heads would bang against the car ceiling, and when we would be right side up, we'd bang hard against the windows, the dashboard, and each other. Empty beer bottles I had forgotten were in the back, smashed and cut us all over, and kept cutting us more times with each tumble the car took down the hill. My entire life flashed in front of my eyes in sequential order, including events I'd forgotten completely, and I found I judged myself as lacking in character. I accepted that I was about to find out what death was really like. Somehow, we were both thrown clear of the car, which landed upside down, smoking, and was clearly never going to be driven by anyone ever again. I hurt too much to be dead, and so I began the task of pulling glass shards out of every part of my body that I could reach. I was cut up pretty badly, and I soon realized my biggest worry from the injuries I had sustained was that one of these cuts might get infected. I started giggling like a kid, and I couldn't control it. I was just amazed I was still alive. "Hey, Henny Youngman, when you're done laughing at how funny this is, can you give me a hand?" I suddenly remembered someone else existed in this world besides me. At that age, it was very hard for me to retain that bit of information. She was stuck under a big, thick, heavy branch that the car must have knocked off a tree as we fell. I couldn't tell how badly she was injured yet. For whatever reason, probably the shock and the awareness that I was now living on borrowed time, I felt great empathy for another person for the first time in my life, and I rushed over to lift the branch off her. We both pulled glass shards out of her skin, but fortunately she, like me, was mostly uninjured. The shock had hit her harder than it hit me, and she was shaking somewhat violently. "I need to ask you a very important question," she stuttered. "What in God's name just happened?" That was a good question, I realized. "Well," I began, wondering how to mansplain this one. "I guess we must have parked too close to the edge and the weight of the car caused us to fall over the—" "But what was rocking the car?" she interrupted. I stared at her blankly, and she continued. "Before we fell, the car rocked back and forth like we were being pushed off the edge." I stared at her, thinking back. I had thought that it was us causing the rocking, but it seemed rude to say that now. I figured I'd better be a man and take control of the situation before her imagination got the better of her. Standing up, I grabbed her hand and lifted her up as well. "Come along, little miss," I condescended. "Let's get this pretty little princess back to her fairy castle before midnight." I started toward the road, but she resisted and pulled back. "Look!" she shouted, and then screamed at the top of her lungs in terror. I turned my head in the direction of what she was screaming at, back on the road where we had initially parked. There, I saw the silhouette of what can only be described as a werewolf. I couldn't tell its color, markings, or features, as it appeared pure black in the shadows lit from behind. What I could tell was that it was standing like a man, but it was not wearing clothes as a man would. Instead, it was covered in hair or fur like a bear. I wondered if it was a man in a ghillie suit, but it had a head more like a dog or a wolf, with tall ears standing up on top of its head. Those ears were clearly real, as it bent them back and the upright dog began to growl at us. My lady friend wept openly and shook in shock and fear. The animal took a step toward us, and my girl screamed at the top of her lungs. The wolf howled back at her, then launched himself from the road in our direction. Our fight-or-flight instincts pumped our legs faster and faster, deeper and deeper into the forest, as far from the dogman as we could get, as fast as we could get there. We fell repeatedly. I know I was getting dizzy from getting up over and over and running straight into branches at full speed, then getting up all over yet again. I can only imagine what the girl was feeling, yet her fear carried her even faster than mine carried mine, and she was wearing heels. When we saw the cabin in the woods, she jumped headfirst through the open window without even knocking first. She reached over and unlocked the front door for me before even wiggling the bottom half of her body through the window. Inside, I closed the heavy wooden front door and bolted it with the two large heavy bolts it had built into it. I looked around for a light switch, but the entire cabin was one room with a fireplace that looked like it had been sealed up many years ago. The floor was dirt, with bits of old garbage around here and there. Nothing we could use as a weapon, though. I noticed that the windows all had heavy wooden shutters, which also had sturdy metal bolts to lock them shut. But they were not shut, and we needed to change that situation fast. "This place has been under attack before," I said, "and that's a good thing for us. Quick, let's close and bolt all the hatch." A freaking tree came smashing through the window that my girl had wiggled in through. A 2-foot-wide tree now entirely filled the window and was lodged 7 or 8 inches deep into the dirt inside. The girl was back to screaming incoherently now, so I left her cowering and shuddering on the dirt floor and bolted the other 3 windows shut while I still could. The tree, now inserted at a 45-degree angle through the front window, began to shake violently as I realized the Dogman was trying to extract it. I guess so he could blow our little piggy house down and have us for dinner? He had done too good a job, though, because the tree was stuck. Even all the strength of that inhuman monster out there couldn't budge the tree, and was going to stay exactly where it was, probably for a long time. The frustration of that drove the creature into a frenzy, and it raced around the outside of our forest prison, banging loudly against the sides and making terrifying noises. I don't know how long this kept up, but I remember that we both just held each other and cried for what seemed like eternity as the thing tried to get in. Must have gone on for hours, banging, screaming, making sounds of horrible-sounding violence of some unknown sort. More banging, more howling. Then everything got quiet, and we waited and waited. And then the birds started singing, and light began to leak in around the edges of the tree in the window. This caused us both to laugh. We laughed as we helped each other off the floor. We laughed as we helped each other unbolt the front door. We laughed as we saw the row of trees knocked down. We laughed as we helped each other back to the road. We laughed as we walked for hours back to town, and we were still chuckling as we checked ourselves into the hospital. In the light of day, we couldn't discuss this insanity with a straight face any longer. The happy ending of the story would be that this event changed me permanently and that I straightened up and became a good guy right then and there, marrying the girl and becoming a mature, responsible member of society thanks to Dogman. But the truth was, I lost touch with the girl quickly. I've never seen her since, and I fell into a dark, withdrawn, unhealthy period for 5 or 6 years after that. I did eventually pull myself back into the world of the living, and these days, I'm fine, thank you. But I've been diagnosed with PTSD, and nothing ever went back to the way it was before we were attacked that night. I'm not so sure that's a bad thing, though. I had a perfect life, and what did I do with it? I squandered it, and used my charm to seduce and use innocent people. Now, I'm severely limited by phobias and trauma, but my life is devoted to helping others and adding something to the world instead of just taking away from it. In some ways, I'm much less of a man than I was back then, but in other ways, I'm much more useful, and I'm able to be supportive of my friends. Dogman to me is not evil, as many call him. It's like saying nature is evil, but nature's not good either. Nature just is, and the Dogman is part of nature's angry side.
I'm hyperventrifying.
Canceled on account of Dogman. As told to Peter Bernard, read by PQ River. Dear Scary Stories, Thank you for using my story on your show. Or if you didn't, why is PQ Ribber reading this right now? I want to point out that I call this I Was a Teenage Dork. I'm sure you've changed it to something with Dogman in the title, but I want the listeners or readers to know that back in the early 80s when this took place, I was, in fact, an extremely pathetic teenage dork. But I was a dork that had a particularly terrifying encounter with what we called a wolf man, but what people nowadays seem to be calling Dogman. Actually, the girl with me called it Cousin It, and she would doodle it on her school desk with sunglasses and a bowler hat prowling the woods. I guess before I explain the monster, I should explain the girl, because she was the only reason I ever saw the Dogman. My high school had homerooms we needed to attend just for the town's attendance record-keeping purposes. We had to sit in assigned alphabetical seats. Just by chance of seating arrangements, I, king of all dorks, sat daily next to the school's queen rocker chick. She was like Riff Randall rock and roller, but replaced the satin with denim and leather. Homeroom was the only class she attended regularly, and it was just so she could officially be listed as present and accounted for and eventually graduate. For whatever reason, she took a liking to me and gave me lessons in how to be less of a dork. She had me grow my hair longer, she had me acquire different clothes, then she changed how I wore the aforementioned clothes. Eventually, as the weather got warmer and our senior year drew to a close, she felt she was finished creating her new Frankenstein monster and that I was now cool enough to hang with her. Bear in mind that she was a precocious 19 and I was a late-blooming 16. Even if she weren't the most in-demand girl in the school, there was no way I would have had the self-esteem to consider myself worthy of hanging with her, but I was flattered that she would express the notion. I was also very relieved that the chances of us ever actually socializing outside of homeroom were virtually zero, since I was nervous even at the thought of it. My father had raised me to always remember that it would be rude of me to be successful in any way, because it would only make him feel worse about his own utter failure in life. This poor girl, she was wasting her respect on me when I knew for a fact I was unworthy of her attention. There was only one guy in the school dorkier than I was, and he was a teacher, but he was not a likable and pathetic, well-meaning dork like me. He was an evil dork. A mean dork, a vicious dork, and a hateful dork. When John Lennon of the Beatles was assassinated, this evil dork said to his class, "1 down, 3 to go." They say everyone has something positive about him, but this guy was the exception to the rule, and he was in charge of the lunch period I had to attend. The way it would go every day was like this. You'd either get on line for your food or find a seat if you brought your own. There was general milling about. Then Dorcas Majoris, the evil teacher, would walk up to the microphone in the front of the room with his stupid whistle. He would stand there looking around for a while. Sometimes he'd look around for a few seconds. Other times he'd stand there for 5 minutes. He varied the time in order to surprise as many kids as he could when he suddenly blew the whistle into the microphone, piercing everyone's eardrums all at once. The sound wouldn't have finished reverberating yet when this sadist would start pointing out students who hadn't immediately frozen to attention when the whistle was blown. Anyone he pointed and screamed at would then be made to stand back to the wall, but not leaning on the wall. That would cost you worse punishment through the entire period, and only have 5 minutes at the end to eat your lunch. It wasn't even just that, but he would scream at you, red-faced, about how you lacked character and how you deserved worse than what he could give you. Like I said, he had no redeeming qualities whatsoever and reminded me of my dad. So one warm, beautiful day, I was sitting with my other dork friends in the lunchroom, listening to Dorcas Majoris screaming abuse at minors in the name of education, when suddenly the rocker chick, let's call her Riff for the purposes of this story, comes running through the lunchroom up to the idiot teacher and starts tickling him. I thought, oh my God, she's going to get a year of detention and never graduate. Instead, to the surprise of every kid in that room, the idiot teacher blushed, and then I swear he giggled. She tickled him again, then playfully squealed, "Can't catch me, bet you can't catch me," running away at top speed in her Converse All-Star sneakers. Amazingly, the moron teacher, guffawing like a 1980s version of Beavis and Butthead, started chasing this 19-year-old girl around the lunchroom. Everyone was laughing hysterically as this guy who had caused us such torment made an utter fool of himself over our friend Riff. And trust me, at that moment, everyone in the room considered Riff their good friend. She was finally getting back at this creep and turning him into a laughing stock in front of the entire school. Around and around the room they went. People were standing on the tables cheering and screaming. I lost sight of where Riff went, and apparently so did Dorcas Majoris, because the next thing I knew, she was tapping me on the shoulder and dragging me out an exit of the school I never even knew existed. Outside, her Bratmobile awaited us, which was an old 70s convertible of one sort or another. I tell you the make and model, except I was a dork back then and had no idea what the difference was between different kinds of cars. But the top was down. I remember that part. She got in and motioned for me to follow. "But it's illegal for us to leave school grounds during the day," I whined. She was laughing before I could finish my statement and revved the engine. "5, she said, looking at me with a smirk. "5, I asked. "4, she continued. Then 3. I got the idea and quickly jumped in the passenger seat, ready to play hooky for the first time in my dorky life with this real-life magic pixie dream girl. I had a lot of trepidation and outright fear in my heart as we took off screeching into the afternoon. I wondered if we would get arrested. I wondered if I would get hit by my father. I wondered if my mother would give me the crying routine about how I had let her down. One thing I certainly did not wonder is if I would end up face to face with a half-man, half-dog creature almost twice my size, and yet that is what actually ended up happening. Riff handled the car like she'd been driving her entire life, and for all I knew, maybe she had. I saw cops up ahead and cringed, sinking down in my seat. I whispered loudly, "Look out, cops, cops." Riff laughed at me again. As we passed the cops, she waved at them. Yes, she waved at the cops as we sped by, illegally off school grounds. Then she called out to them, "Toodaloo," in a high-pitched, sarcastically sweet manner. And the cops smiled and waved back. One of them called out, "Hi, Riff." I realized she had every guy in that area of the country in her back pocket. I wondered why, if she could be hanging with any kid or man, she was hanging with me. "Doesn't it hurt your back?" she asked. "Doesn't what hurt my back?" I asked back. "Sitting scrunched down in your seat," she answered. "Are you embarrassed to be seen with me?" Sitting up as tall as I could, I saw that we were driving north to Westchester and asked her where she was taking me. "To my weekly Satanist cabal," she answered plainly. "You're going to be our human sacrifice, if that's all right with you." I remember sitting through a red light staring at her. Yes, she actually stopped for red lights, the same as mortals. I was wondering how to ask if she was joking about sacrificing me to Satan. I mean, it made more sense than her actually wanting to hang out with me, and yet I was really hoping that was just a joke, for all the obvious reasons. "I was joking," she said finally, so she could read minds too. I found her more awesome and frightening than ever before, and that's saying something. She described where she was taking me, which she called a secret party. From the description she proceeded to give, it sounded sort of like what might now be called a rave, but in a low-tech 1981 sort of a way. Apparently, the party had been going on since the night before, and she wanted to bring me out to meet some musicians who played in bands she knew I liked. "I can't believe you're having multi-day parties with famous punk rockers," I shouted, realizing it was a lie. On second thought, of course you're having multi-day parties with punk rockers. Turns out that the party was off a highway, up a dirt road, and past a dirt patch where she parked the car. She took me by the hand, and we walked to the party, which was about 35 or 40 people in a clearing, blasting a cassette tape recording of Timmy Somer's Noise the Show out of a boombox. Some people were standing around, others were passed out on blankets, and a few couples seemed to be necking, a shocking sight to my virgin eyes. Riff brought me over to a person who was still too famous even in 2017 for me to mention his name. She introduced us, then whispered in my ear she was going to mingle-mangle, and suddenly I was alone with one of my musical idols. He was flattered that I knew which songs on his records he wrote, so he introduced me to other cool people, and I was soon having a great time. After an hour or two, Riff came back to hang with me, and we talked and laughed. I'd never felt so happy in my life. I was actually beginning to feel like I belonged with these kinds of people, in spite of all my father's insistence to the contrary. She took my hand again and walked me along a little footpath that led us both into the forest. I wondered why she was holding my hand, and if there was something I was supposed to do in return. I found out that I wasn't the only one wondering this, as shouts came from behind us, followed by 4 tall, mean-looking heavy metal dudes. I recognized these guys. My friends and I called them the Bias. That's because the only time we saw them, they were working on their cars, saying to each other, "Hey, pass me another Bia." We regarded them as human jokes, but we'd never gotten them angry at us before. "What do you think you're doing, holding Riff's hand, you little twerp?" asked their apparent leader. "Calm down, Jacko," warned Riff. "I'm not your girlfriend, and I never was." "Oh, yeah?" shouted the very tall, very wide, and very hairy Jacko, with a look on his face like he was trying to think of something to say next. He stood there for a while with that expression, unable to generate a follow-up. Then one of the other Bias whispered something in his ear, and Jacko regained his sense of purpose. "I asked you why you're holding my girl's hand, you little creep," he spat out at me. "She grabbed it first. It was her idea," I whined. Now even Riff looked at me disgustedly. She took her hand back, and the rain of eggs started. Apparently, the fellows had somehow acquired a dozen or more white chicken eggs from some source unbeknownst to me, and now they were using their manual dexterity to hurl them in my direction. Eggs were on my clothes, in my hair, and on my face, both figuratively and literally. I even caught one in my left hand, almost by accident. Riff moved between me and my attackers to stop them momentarily, and I took that moment to escape, running further into the forest, terrified. I was running, looking over my shoulder, and idiotically ran straight into a branch, falling forward and hitting the ground hard, knocking all the wind out of me. That's when I saw it. The Dogman. It came out of the bushes with a roar. Maybe it was sleeping or something, but I surprised it, and boy, was it angry. It towered over me and filled my blurry vision. I tried to scream, but like I said, all the wind had been knocked out of me. I tried to breathe in, and even that was difficult and painful. The creature loomed over me and roared again. This time, leaning forward in my face to make its point more clearly. I could feel its hot breath burn into my skin like a wet heat lamp. I could smell 1,000,000 years of death and rot in its scream. Then it stopped. It looked confused. It started sniffing the air, then sniffing me. Then it licked me. Or I should say it licked the egg on me, and licked, and licked. This was a dogman who liked eggs. I figured when it got tired of licking, it might take a bite. That would not be a good thing, at least not for me. Then I remembered the egg I had caught and showed it to him, offering it to him. This is when I noticed that the creature had hands. Well, clawed hands, not human hands, but not dog's paws either. Its hands had thumbs, so it could hold things. It grabbed the egg out of my hand and smelt it for a while. I took this opportunity to stand up and back away slowly from the monster. I never took my eye off as it cracked the egg open and slurped up the contents. Back I went, one step at a time, then BAM! I had walked backward into someone. Probably one of the idiots who pelted me with eggs looking to come back and finish the job. Suddenly, those bullies seemed a lot less intimidating than they had before, and I turned around furiously and ready to defend myself against Riff? It was Riff, standing there, looking past me in shock. I didn't have to guess what she was staring at. I spoke to her, but got no response. She was so surprised at what she was seeing. In fact, I think that's the only time I ever saw her as the surprisee instead of the surpriser. I really wanted to get out of there, and I tried pulling her along with me, but she wouldn't budge. I wasn't going to leave without her, so I joined her in just staring at the monster. It wasn't the kind of creature I see in your other videos. It didn't look sleek at all. It looked shaggy. In fact, I once made a joke with Riff about the Shaggy DA, but she'd never heard of the movie, and I didn't want to seem like a dork who watched Disney films to her, so I just dropped it. But it was a shaggy-looking creature that seemed like a dog in all ways except that it stood on its hind legs, and its front paws seemed like hands. It was also a lighter color than most of the dogmen I see depicted on the internet. It was a light-colored, shaggy, upright, walking dog-like creature with floppy dog ears. It was not wolf-like in any way, but it did sort of resemble the Lon Chaney Wolfman from the old black and white movies, if he had grown his hair long and become a rocker. The hairy forest monster finished with its egg and dropped it, watching us and panting, with its tongue hanging out. Quietly, Riff said, "Don't move." I didn't. The creature eyed us a while longer, then dropped to all fours and howled. My heart was beating so hard I thought it would explode. I wanted to run so badly, but I held my ground there next to Riff. We both watched as the creature ran off into the woods on all fours, gone from sight in 3 leaps. We got back to the party and related what had happened to the group of the others. Riff had made one of the Bias give her his t-shirt for me to replace my egg-drenched one with, and she gave it to me to wear. "Foreigner?" I asked. "You want me to wear a foreigner t-shirt?" "Well, the guy with the AC/DC t-shirt has bad body odor," she explained. "My choices are limited, so you're not allowed to complain." I wore it inside out. It was way too large on me. I knew I looked dumb, but Not as dumb as the Bia who Riff forced to wear my egg-drenched Ramones t-shirt. It covered his chest, but his impressive gut remained entirely exposed to the air. Everyone packed up quickly, and that next night of the party was canceled on account of Dogman. Riff and I went back to being homeroom friends, which was fine with me. I don't think my heart could have stood anything more than that. I was just not as cool as her, at least not at that age. We never saw that half-dog, half-man thing again, but we talked about him a lot, and we both used to draw him in homeroom. We drew him in our notebooks and carved images of him onto our desks as well. Mine were always scary, but hers were always cute. One time she drew him playing electric guitar with his axe hanging low. I wonder how such a creature could have ever come into existence. It looked like a household pet mutated into a monster. Could something like that have evolved naturally on its own? Or might it be the result of some sort of bioengineering or selective breeding program? It was definitely not a Bigfoot because it had dog ears and a dog-like snout and nose. Plus, I don't know if Bigfoot is as shaggy as this thing was. All I know is, if you ever party or camp up in the woods in Westchester, be safe. Remember to bring a lot of eggs with you. I'd like to take a moment to say that if you have a scary story you'd like to tell us here, you can write Peter at peterbernard.com, or you can call our new Scary Stories hotline number and leave it to us in the form of a voicemail message. It's easy to remember. 804-LESCARY. That's 804-LESCARY, or 804-537-2279. That's a voicemail-only number, so don't expect any of us to pick up. And now, back to the spookeriness.
Scary Stories by Peter Bernard. Number 2.
Dogman broke up my marriage, as told to Peter Bernard, read by Madeline Starr. This story has a provocative title, but in truth, I probably would have broken up with that man sooner or later anyway. It's definitely true, though, that Dogman sped up the process. Today, my divorce officially went through, and I can leave this chapter of my life behind me. Before I do, I want to once and for all write down the true story of what happened. I'm not going to reveal my name, and I'm going to change a couple of facts so that you can't figure out who I am. And then I will never discuss this again. But I know I'll feel better if I tell the truth about this just once, even if it is to you, who are all strangers I will never meet. When I turned 29, I got married. I was the last of my group of friends to do this. We were all single when we were 27, and married before we were 30. Only one of us is still married, though. It turns out marriage is something you should do when you really love someone, not out of fashion to keep up with your friends. The guy I married had everything anyone from my social group could want in a man. He was good-looking enough, from a nice enough family, he had a good enough job, and he was reasonably good-looking. He had, and still has, all it takes to be a successful man and an adequate enough father. Because of Dogman, though, I found out about his major character flaw, and it destroyed my ability to feel deep emotion for him any longer. For our honeymoon, we got a luxury suite in a hotel located on the edge of a vast wilderness. We could enjoy a gourmet breakfast, then hike all day in stunningly beautiful wilderness, then return in time for a shower or sauna, and a meal prepared by a rotating staff of the top chefs in that region of the country. It seemed like the best of both worlds. At least at first. On our third day, we still hadn't left the hotel, and I was itching for a wilderness adventure, so I talked the hubby into joining me. I never had heard him whine and complain so much before. It was too hot. The trail was too steep. The bugs were too buggy. He wanted his mommy. I made up that last one, but you get the idea. I actually really like going on long hikes. I sometimes will camp in the wilderness for a week if I can find the time to do it. The hubby was talking like he'd never seen a mosquito before, and was acting like he was going to faint or something. It was getting kind of annoying, as I usually hike with women and their tolerance is far above the hubby's. He's taller than I am. It just seemed like he was exaggerating his troubles and expecting me to feel sorry for him. The more he complained, the faster I would travel. I think just to try to get away from the whining. I was so focused on blocking out everything he was saying that I failed to notice it was now long past time to start heading back. I climbed on a tall rock nearby to get my bearings. Maybe I could spot a shorter path back than the way we got here. Maybe I could save us some time and get us back to the hotel before dark. After all, hubby might turn into a pumpkin out here at midnight. To my amazement, there was a clear path that wound around a little bit, but mostly headed directly back to the hotel. I couldn't believe our luck, that the rock was there and I had decided to look right then. I would not have been able to see the path from almost any other angle or location. It filled me with a sense of wonder and gratitude. But then hubby, complained that his feet were sore, and I realized we still had a lot of hiking ahead of us. Hopping down off the rock, I informed him of our change in plans. He started moaning about something or other as I tore straight through the tall grass toward the other pathway I had spotted. At this point, I almost didn't care if he got lost behind me. It was his job to keep up with me now. We hiked for about 90 minutes, with him panting and complaining the entire way. I hadn't responded to anything he'd said in over an hour, but it hadn't slowed him down. I was focused on the fact that it was now starting to get dark, and I still could not see the back of the hotel in front of us, so I really had no clear idea how much farther we had to go. The hubby was so obsessed with his minor aches and pains that he didn't even notice it was getting dark, or else he was so denatured as to not understand that humans are not nocturnal animals, but there are predators in the forests who are. He was about to be taught this lesson by life and death themselves. We came around a patch of trees, and were met with a wall of strong odor. It was the smell of death, or all the smells of death. I gagged, then looked around to see what had died. There was a man there. He was in a dark area under a large tree and between patches of tall bushes. But there was just enough light to show me that he was facing away from us. He was squatting. My first thought was, this is a psychotic. We need to get away from him before he kills and eats us. My husband had different thoughts. "Oh, excuse us. We didn't mean to disturb you, sir. My wife seems to think this is the better path to take than the correct path, and you see," the man stood up, and he kept standing up. He was a very tall man. He turned around and took a step towards us, and he was growling like an animal. Another step brought enough of him into the light that I could see he wasn't a man after all. He was a large wolf or dog-like creature, but he was walking on his hind legs, much like a bear. His front paws were huge and looked more like hands for some reason. He held a broken-off piece of bone, which he then threw violently to the ground and proceeded to howl incredibly loudly. I started to run, then looked back to see if the hubby was following. He wasn't. He was on his knees, crying and begging the dog thing to spare his life. He had no fight or flight instinct. He was just trying to reason with nature. I actually thought about going back there and trying to drag him out, but I realized he was too heavy for me to drag, and it would just get both of us killed. I ran back to the hotel and immediately alerted security that my husband was lost back on the trail and being attacked by some kind of bear or wolf or something. I expected them to bring him back in pieces. Instead, they recovered him less than a half hour later. He was shivering and muttering crazy things, and he had soiled himself. What a man. He was so pathetic the Dogman didn't even want to eat him. You can call me cruel, but I filed for divorce the next day, after he was let go from the hospital. He's better off with a woman who stays indoors and doesn't challenge him. And even though Dogman did break up my marriage, I'm grateful to him. He showed me that I need brave people around me. I've entirely rearranged my life since that experience. I've moved to a new town, started a new career, made new friends, and I am a lot happier and more present than I have ever been before. I helped form a Dogman research group with the help of new friends and acquaintances, and we go hiking in search of the Dogman. We don't expect to capture one, and we don't expect to make friends with them. It's just kind of a dare. Are you brave enough to risk encountering Dogman? And are you brave enough to risk it all again? Tomboy vs. Dogman, as told to Peter Bernard, read by Madeline Starr. When I was a girl, I was what we used to call a tomboy. I don't know what the politically correct term would be for that now. There were only 2 other kids my age in my neighborhood, and they were both boys, so they were who I hung with. I learned to keep up with them, but I always felt like I was definitely the low man on the totem pole in both of their eyes. One time the 3 of us were together exploring the woods when I saw an incredibly large, saber-toothed dog watching us from the bushes. I whispered to the guys 3 times that we had to get out of there and that a dog or coyote or something was hunting us, and they just laughed me off each time because I was a girl. I could have just run off and left them, but I didn't. Then they both saw the huge dog themselves, and do you know what they did? They ran off and left me. We each ran in different directions. I don't think the dog followed any of us, fortunately. So yeah, when you're a kid and you see a saber-toothed giant dog, you don't tell your parents about it. Doesn't everybody see giant wolf things with foot-long teeth? In spite of feeling a bit unappreciated, I was a pretty happy kid until my parents managed to pull the entire town and much of that part of our state into the argument that eventually led to their divorce. It was the late 1990s, remembered now mostly for grunge, rap, and Bill Clinton. But for a lot of people my age, it also meant our schools suddenly forcing us to wear uniforms. It was a movement that swept the nation at the time. The narrative was something like, kids are knifing each other to steal designer shoes. We'll stop school violence if we institute a strict uniform policy. My mother took this message to heart and formed an advocacy group to get school uniforms in our part of the state. My father was horrified by my mother's stance because he was an old hippie and didn't want to see his perfect and saintly genius daughter, that's me, being forced to wear a uniform like a prison inmate. The battle raged on for a couple of years, but Mom's side won. By that point, I was in high school, so I didn't think it would affect me. I was wrong. When they first instituted the uniform policy, it went from kindergarten to senior year in high school. Only 2 years later, they cut it back to end in middle school, and they liberalized the uniform choices and made them more casual. They soon adapted to comfortable pullover tops and gave multiple choices for pants, shorts, or skirts. But back in that first semester, the uniform policy was like something designed by the evil Principal Togar from Rock and Roll High School. Boys had to wear ties, and girls had to wear these dark skirts and light socks. My mother laughed like an evil villain defeating Batman the first time she saw me in my uniform, coming down to breakfast. My father and I both felt humiliated and defeated, but he was taking it worse than I was. I was mostly curious to see what my two friends would look like in ties. I walked to the school bus stop on the corner and met my friends, who were early, as usual, horsing around with each other. When they saw me, their jaws dropped, and they started acting all weird. I thought they were making fun of me, and we all rode to school together, hardly saying a word to each other. I felt like they didn't like me anymore, and so I was surprised to see them waiting for me after school in our usual spot. I was even more surprised when they apologized for not making better conversation that morning. They no longer seemed at all interested in each other, and now anything I said became infinitely fascinating to them for the first time ever. Soon I understood that this was just them suddenly realizing I wasn't one of the boys after all, that I was a girl. I'm honest enough to admit that this filled my heart with glee. Not because I liked either of them back so much, but just because suddenly I went from the least important person in the group to the star. At home, Mom and Dad's fighting grew, and Dad threatened to leave and take me with him to a district with no school uniform policy. At that point, even though I knew I agreed with Dad's opinion on the subject, I somewhat selfishly began siding with Mom. I had status in my tiny peer group, and I wanted to keep it. Mom used her connections, and I even made appearances with her to speak out in favor of the uniform policy. Seeing me on TV campaigning for what he fought so hard against hurt Dad badly. But all I cared about is that seeing me on TV made the boys obey me even more slavishly. I went from having no power to being power-mad overnight. I enjoyed this lifestyle greedily, playing both boys against each other for my own entertainment. Then one day, karma came ready to collect the debt my selfishness had been piling up. We three were in the forest when I had a weird sense of déjà vu. I didn't like the feeling. It felt like before the boys adored me, back when I was the third wheel. It went away and came back a few more times, and I began to search our surroundings with my eyes. I saw it. There it was, just like the last time. It was the huge dog in the forest, with the incredibly long teeth. I gasped. Unlike last time, both boys immediately ran to my side, each trying to be more gallant and protective than the other. This time, when I pointed into the woods, they both immediately charged in the direction I pointed, presumably to do battle with the perceived enemy. The more I screamed at them to come back, the more they insisted they had the situation under control, until I could see they were nearly upon the large, vicious-looking beast. I could no longer speak. I couldn't even breathe, horrified at what might happen next. It looked like the boys could not yet, from their vantage point, even see what they were coming up on. Then it stood up. The dog stood up on its hind legs and growled. It stood so high that from my point of view, its head was now behind the leaves of the tree it was standing near. It looked 3 times bigger than the boys, who now definitely saw it. They both screamed briefly, then slumped forward, looking like they had fallen asleep. At the time, I thought the dogman had hypnotized them, but I'm pretty sure they just fainted from the shock. The wolf-like man walked casually over their unconscious bodies, as though deciding which piece of chicken to have for lunch. I realized I had to act fast, so I gathered up rocks and just started pelting the creature with them. I didn't know how hard I threw back then, but I later had some of my softball pitches clocked at 85 miles per hour. So let's just say I threw hard, and I threw accurately. I coupled the barrage of rocks with shouts of, "Bad doggy!" and other things you might say to a misbehaving pet. Laugh if you will, but the 12-foot-tall carnivorous monster dogman thing whimpered and yelped like a dog you stepped on the tail of. Then ran off into the forest, leaving us alone. I hung out, waiting for the boys to wake up. I felt it was time to stop playing them both, stop leading them both on. I decided to leave it to chance, and that whichever of them woke up first would get to be my boyfriend, with the other one staying our best friend. Then, I kicked the better-looking one until he woke up. The end.
Boy Who Cried DOGMAN, as told to Peter Bernard, read by PQ River. A lot of you out there are interested in Dogman, but I was into Dogman before some of you were born. See, I was a kid in Michigan when the Beast of Bray Road got written about in 40 Times and other spooky magazines of that era. We're talking, I guess, 1996, 95. I had a cassette of the Dogman Legend song that one of my uncles gave me for Halloween when I was younger, and I had a Michigan Dogman t-shirt from a tourist shop. All I know is, for about 2 years, all I was interested in was the Dogman. When it came back in the 2000s with the Gable film and all that, I didn't get as excited. That's because in between those two periods, I came face to face with the Dogman himself. And I've never been the same person again since. Back then, I'd ask my parents to drive down Bray Road whenever we were heading anywhere, and it reached the point where we'd get into the car and they'd preempt my request with an announcement that we were not driving on Bray Road, so I'd better not even ask. They weren't scared of seeing the monster or anything, they just didn't believe any of it at all. I wanted to visit the witnesses to ask them all sorts of questions. To me, they were celebrities, but aside from a few articles and one time on TV, it was hard to find out more about them. We didn't have Facebook and Twitter back then either. We barely had email. So instead of following them on social media, I annoyed my parents about them instead. After a while, they both ordered me never to speak to them again about Dogman. That's how bad it got. I could never imagine telling my kids they aren't allowed to talk to me about Bobo from Finding Bigfoot, which is their favorite topic. But at the age of 10, I was literally banned from speaking, writing, or thinking about the Michigan Dogman, a.k.a. the Beast of Bray Road. Soon my teacher and even some of my friends followed suit. My real name starts with a D, so they would call me D, the Dogman, or Dogman D. I thought it sounded cool, but I don't think they meant it as a compliment. After a while, I moved on to other things. Entering the 7th grade 2 years later, I made a new best friend. Let's call him Upton Smythe, just for fun. He was a rich kid, although I didn't realize that until one night he came over for dinner and my father flipped out. Turns out Upton was the son of a guy my father had been trying to get to do business with probably since before I was born. My father talked to Upton more than I did that night, and before my mom drove my friend home to his palatial estate, my dad had somehow secured an invitation to a country club as Upton's dad's guest the following Sunday. This is where Dogman actually comes into the story. Just give me a minute to explain. So that Sunday, my father and Upton's father playing golf, and for some reason they were forcing us to ride along with them in their golf buggies when we would have rather been anywhere else. Dad hit one into this little outcrop of the woods, and Upton's dad let him call a do-over since it was just a friendly game. Dad ordered me to go get the ball for him out of the woods. I trudged over the grass towards the trees, which seemed a lot further away walking than they had sitting in the little moon buggy back there. I felt weirder and weirder while walking toward the patch of forest. I noticed that it looked to be a tiny cluster of medium-sized trees, but actually spread forward in a line about 10 trees wide on for hundreds of feet, continuing back into a genuinely huge, old-growth forest with immense trees that looked large enough to cover packs of dinosaurs from being seen. I want to say I was feeling dizzy, but that would not be the correct term. I'm not sure exactly what I was feeling, except that it was not comfortable, and the closer I got to the forest, the more unpleasant it grew. I stopped and looked back at my father, who wasn't paying attention to me, but was still kissing up to his new friend. Upton was sitting looking bored and annoyed. They seemed as far away as the trees. I turned around and continued toward the forest. When I finally reached the trees and peered in past them, I realized that the canopy above was extremely dense and it looked incredibly dark in there. Now, a sting of fear shot through me, which was like giving adrenaline to that other weird feeling I already had. I really did not want to go in those trees, but my father would beat me if I didn't, and I was more afraid of him than anything else, so in I went. After only 2 steps into the darkness, I stopped and shivered all over. It was noticeably colder in there, but that wasn't the only reason to shiver. Everything was different in there. Sound was different, the ground was softer and muddier, and there was almost no light at all. I stood there waiting for my eyes to adjust a bit. It was so quiet in there. I started gently moving bushes and small trees to one side or another, looking for my father's stupid golf ball. From the ineffectual way he had hit it, I didn't expect it to be very far in, and I was hoping I would have found it already. No such luck. Only one option. Walk further into the incredibly dark, remarkably silent forest. I walked as slowly and silently as I could because I had the oddest feeling that I would be in danger if I made too much noise. Even as a 12-year-old kid, I told myself this was a nonsensical fear. Still, I rustled leaves as gently as I could and watched where I was going, so as to not even break a twig by accident. I regretted not noting the time before I entered because it seemed as though I'd been walking through these trees for a few minutes already and still hadn't found anything. I looked around and realized I couldn't see the edge of the trees to my left or right any longer. I wasn't sure if that meant I was in a wider patch of woods or if I had gotten confused as to which way was left and which way was right. I started to feel a bit panicked and realized I might be lost. And that's when I heard it. A very low, very deep growling. I spun in circles quickly, looking around, trying to tell what was making that sound and which direction it was coming from. Then 2 trees parted, and out walked the largest and most vicious-looking creature I had ever seen in my life. It was tall and it was wide. It had a chest like a man, arms like a man, but a dog head and dog legs. I just looked up at it, and I was thinking, it's all wrong. I had read so much about Dogman, and I had a certain internal vision of what it looked like, based on illustrations I'd seen in magazines. This was not that. This was something from a nightmare. This was an impossibility. This was like a Lost in Space monster, except the mouth moved realistically. Oh boy, did the mouth move. The creature growled louder, staring directly into my eyes, and showed off its impressive fangs for me. Now let me remind you, I had wanted nothing but for this exact thing to happen to me for around 2 years by that point. But when it did actually happen, do you know what I did? I started crying. Remember, I was 12 years old and kind of a bookish kid. Do they use that term anymore? What are bookish kids now? Kindleish? Anyways, I was not athletic, and I was not certain of myself, and I certainly never expected to meet an immense, weird-looking, growling dogman on a country club golf course. I did remember something I'd read once about how if you're facing a possible attack from a predator, running away only tells them that you consider yourself its prey. It makes them want to eat you even more. I needed to get away from the monster, but I couldn't run away. I had to leave the way another predator would. So I had to act like I was trying to avoid a fight, not avoid being eaten for brunch. So, watching the creature intently and trying my 12-year-old best to act casual and cool, I began backing away, slowly. The creature just stood there and watched. I backed away and eventually picked up a bit of speed. The creature allowed me to leave, just standing there and watching me. When I had gotten past some bushes and could no longer see the dogman, I turned around and returned to walking normally, making certain not to speed up my pace while the creature was still in the vicinity. Then I heard a crazy crashing behind me and turned around to see the dogman had run up quickly and found a new position to watch me from. As I stood looking at him, he looked back at me. He still seemed in a vicious mood, but now his expression also contained some curiosity in it. We repeated this process for a while, with me walking slowly away and the dogman periodically moving to view me from a different angle, but he never got closer than about 15 or 20 feet each time. It suddenly dawned on me that I had no idea what direction I was walking in. Maybe the dog instincts in the monster were causing it to herd me back toward its home, where it would be more convenient to eat me. I had to figure out what direction I should be heading in. I found moss on one side of a tree, then tried to remember which side of a tree moss grows on. South? Then I remembered I had no idea at all of the layout of the golf course, so even if I knew which way was north, I still didn't know which way it was to my dad. I felt so sad that I actually missed my father. I could see our entire relationship passing in front of my eyes. Yes, he was an idiot, but it was funny the way he said laboratory for laboratory. He wasn't all bad, and I missed him. All these years I had wanted to get away from him and get to know more about Dogman, and now that it was happening, I was wasting the moment wishing I could go back to the life I had wanted to escape from in the first place. The next time I stopped to rest, I watched the Dogman watching me. Its head was so large. It looked wrong for the dimensions of the body. It was like the Tyrannosaurus of dog people. "This is a dream, isn't it?" I remember asking the Dogman. He turned his giant head to the side, questioningly. I looked around in all directions and focused on listening to hear any signs of civilization. I heard none, but I noticed that the forest was distinctly less dark in one direction. After I felt I had regained my strength, I made off in that direction and could quickly see that it was leading to a clearing in the woods. Careful not to speed up my pace, I continued and soon could hear the sounds of people and clinking cutlery. It was a restaurant or bar and people being served at outdoor seating. I was saved. If I could only get these last 100 or 2 yards further, make it to the clearing where the people could see me and hear my cries for help. I let out a different kind of cry as something grabbed the back of my pants and dragged me away from the people, further into the woods. The dogman had me by the back of my pants. It was both whining and growling at the same time. It sounded pleading and threatening both at once. Amazingly, I found myself dragged back to my last resting place, and then the dogman retreated to his watching position. For the first time, I forgot about being scared, and this animal just had me annoyed. So that's when I did something else I had learned from reading. I decided to play dead. I lay down in as comfortable a position as I was going to find in that little clearing, and I did my best to just stop moving. I lay there for what seemed like forever, waiting to hear the sound of the monster going away. The next thing I knew, I was waking up, and it was darker, almost sunset. I'd fallen asleep there, I guess, from the stress and exhaustion. I looked around and couldn't see the huge wolf creature. Then I heard it snoring. There, about 10 or 15 feet away, the dogman slept. He looked kind of like any other large dog sleeping. Looking at his hind legs laying there, I couldn't understand how he could stand up and run on them, as they looked exactly like dog legs. I've read and heard accounts from others who say they've heard the dog legs cracking when it goes from a four-legged to two-legged position, but I noticed nothing like that at the time. To me, it just seemed to be able to be either bipedal or else down on all fours at will. I watched it sleeping there so peacefully. Then I realized that this was my chance to get away. No matter how sweet it looked in sleep, this creature had made it clear he would not tolerate my escape. So I had to use all the stealth at my tween-aged command, which was next to none. I got about halfway to the edge of the woods when I slipped in the mud and made a racket falling. Before I could get up, I already heard the dogman behind me howl. I screamed like a 6-year-old and raced for the clearing. Can't remember what I said, but I remember it included words both parents had strictly forbidden me from saying. I made it to the clearing and headed straight for the supper crowd dining after a day of golf, screaming at the top of my lungs that a werewolf was trying to eat me. Rather than come help me, they all stared in horror as I approached. I noticed they were staring at me, not at anything behind me. I risked a glance and saw that the creature was nowhere to be found. It had decided to remain hidden. I was safe. I fell to my knees and wept. Eventually, some waiters came out to see me. I told them my name, and they talked to some lady who led me to a man who led me to another building with a barely furnished room, inside where my father, Upton, and his father were sitting on old wooden chairs. I raced to my father and hugged him. He hugged me back, but unenthusiastically. Upton said something like, "We thought you were a goner, man," and I told him I thought the same thing. I looked up at my dad, and I was going to say something, but I saw he was not happy, and he was giving me a very stern look. "What's this garbage they told me you were shouting about the wolf man again?" he asked. Then, before I could answer, he started angrily lecturing me about all the ways he was going to punish me. He really caused a scene, and Upton's dad had to make him stop. He pointed out that I was just a kid, and I had just gone through a trauma. My father told him I made it all up to get attention. He said I faked the entire thing just to make him look bad. Upton's dad looked my father straight in the eye and told him he didn't need me to make him look bad. He did a pretty good job of it all by himself. We were escorted out of the country club by security, and my father blamed me for it for the rest of the time that I knew him. Upton was still my friend at school, and I was allowed to visit him at his house, but he wasn't allowed over my house anymore, which infuriated my father. He had bragged so much about being friends with Upton's dad that he really lost face at his job and eventually left like 8 or 9 months later to a harder job that paid less. The Dogman really ended any chance of a friendship between myself and my father because Dad blamed me for every single bad thing in his life from then on. So although I was not eaten by the Dogman, that doesn't mean it wasn't a force of evil in my life. It can't be denied that it contributed to the destruction of my father and our family. I have to agree with the people who think Dogman is evil, whatever that may actually mean. I guess I'm trying to say I think they are unhealthy for us humans. They are on a different wavelength. I somehow felt that creature before I saw or heard him. It was not a pleasant feeling, and not one I would ever want to have again. You don't feel things like that from something that you should try to be friends with. Maybe evil is relative based on what is potentially damaging to you personally. On the other hand, if the Dogman had eaten me for lunch, that wouldn't really have been evil. It would have been an animal, satisfying its hunger, which is the way of nature. What the Dogman did was worse than that. The Dogman took the love out of our lives, what little there had been before. That's an unnatural and cruel, pointless thing to do. A classic lose-lose situation. I guess that is what I'd say to define the kind of evil I think the Dogman represents. Bad luck, bad omens. The kind of ill will that none of us truly understand or can even be certain is real, but we all have words for anyway. While I love hearing stories of other people's encounters with this creature, and I'll always find it a fascinating subject, I never again want to come face to face with it. And while I enjoy these stories thoroughly, my advice for any of you asking how to see Dogman in person is, don't go into the woods that you've heard Dogman inhabits. Just don't. But if you get found by Dogman anyway, play dead. It's better than the alternative. Dogman in New Jersey? As told to Peter Bernard, read by PQ River. This story took place in Wharton State Forest in New Jersey back in summer 2001, a few months before 9/11 happened. I lost my sister and 2 friends in the World Trade Center, so I tend to measure things in terms of pre-9/11 and post-9/11. One of my friends who died in the WTC later was with me that day. Let's call him Phil. And he brought along his fiancée that he never lived long enough to marry. I hate telling this story, not because I'm afraid people will think I'm crazy for saying I saw a monster, but because it reminds me of how much I still miss Phil. We used to camp in the forest since we were teenagers, and by this time we were old men in our later 20s, so we were pretty set in our ways. We each brought our own tent and half the supplies, and would stay in the most remote places we could manage to hike to. Phil's fiancée, we'll call her Cinnamon, also loved staying out all night in the forest, but she owned a Winnebago Chieftain with a microwave, a TV, state-of-the-art VHS player, fancy shower she had specially built for her, all the modern conveniences her ample Wall Street salary could buy. I was dead set against sleeping in a camper, so we compromised and convinced Cinnamon we'd camp in our tents right outside the Winnebago. This way we could run inside if anything too scary happened. I figured I was humoring the lady. I didn't actually expect anything bad to happen, since nothing bad had ever happened to me or Phil on any of our previous excursions. The two of us built a fire to roast s'mores after Cinnamon's sumptuous microwave TV dinner feast, and we were surprised when Ms. Diva herself actually came out into the forest proper to sit under the moon with us and enjoy the evening air. I'd brought some craft beer that an old buddy of mine and Phil's had brewed, and soon even Cinnamon had loosened up. We were telling old stories and enjoying each other's company. After a while, I felt familiar enough with Cinny, and drunk enough in general, that I just asked her outright, "Why, if you love nature, do you stay inside a Winnebago all the time instead of in nature?" "Oh, she's got good reasons, dude. Believe me," Phil squirted out nervously. "In fact," he continued, "it's a story that it's kind of a little too creepy to tell here in the middle of nowhere. Let her tell you the story next week over lunch in the city." Both Cinnamon and I began teasing Phil that he was a scaredy cat and a chicken, until he relented and gave Cinnamon permission to finally explain to me why she only camps out behind metal and glass in her trailer. "Well, it was years ago in a forest very much like this one," she began, and I settled back, ready to hear the tale. "I was camping much like you two do with my Uncle Freddie. We had 2 small tents and precious little else with us. This was our 4th time out in the forest alone, and even though I was only 12 years old, I felt very comfortable in the wilderness as long as Uncle Freddie was there. We always found the closest ranger and introduced ourselves before setting up camp, and Freddie made me memorize and describe to him how I could reach the ranger in an emergency if anything should happen to him. We were both very proud of our foresight and our ability to plan things out logically. What could possibly go wrong for 2 brilliant, careful people like us? So on that night, we found out exactly what could go wrong." "Get to the story already," I whined. "My beer's getting warm." "Shh, don't spoil the spooky mood," Phil admonished me. "Okay, all right," I relented, "but please finish before I have to pee. Deal?" Cinnamon jokingly agreed and returned to her story. "So, Uncle Freddie was telling me a ghost story from when he was a kid. He said that when the ghost was there, you could tell before it did even anything. He said you could hear the air change, whatever that meant. And he said the ghost would throw rocks at them from the ceiling. It had good aim, and the neighbors thought his parents beat him because he always had bruises on his face from the ghost's rocks. And just as he said that, I swear to God, a rock flew into our camp from somewhere. I was terrified because I thought it was the ghost from Uncle Freddie's story. But Uncle Freddie didn't think that. He got up really angry, stood up and shouted, 'Think you're funny? Think you're funny?' And just then a small rock zipped across the forest and hit him right on the cheek, knocking him backward. I screamed over and over. That's all I remember doing. Uncle Freddie stood up again and started cursing, using nasty words I'd never heard before. He said, 'You ain't nothing but a punk-ass teenager. If you think you're so big and bad, why don't you come out here and fight like a real man?' And so right then, his adversary did step out of the forest, wasn't a ghost like I thought, and it wasn't a punk teenager like Uncle Freddy thought. It was the tallest, hairiest man I had ever seen. My first instinct was to run, but Uncle Freddy told me never to run from something that can eat you. It only makes them hungrier, so I stood my ground and looked to Freddy to see what we should do. He stood there just looking, with his mouth hanging open. Then he grabbed my hand and we ran, running through the thorn bushes and banging our heads on tree branches in the dark. I'm sure the monster could have caught us easily, but fortunately for us, he was just happy we were leaving his turf. We made it to the ranger station in no time and told him the story. He gave us a place to sleep and told us he'd head back to our camp in the morning to guard us as we packed up our tents and equipment. Well, I tell you, the next morning our camp was shredded. The tents were ripped, our food was either gone or strewn around, even our compasses and camera had been stomped into oblivion. Now, I still love nature, but what I do not like is accidentally being on the turf of an 8-foot-tall apex predator. I packed my Winnebago to face the way I came in, so that when someone or something asks me to leave, they never have to ask twice. I was about to ask her if she'd ever had anything like that ever happen again when the quiet of the forest was interrupted by the loudest barking I'd ever heard. I call it barking because I don't know what else to call it. It sounded almost like language. If a dog or wolf could speak, I'd imagine it sounding like this sound. Whatever was being said, it was without a doubt an angry message. "What was that?" Phil asked, jumping to his feet. "Damn it, I told you this was not the place for that kind of story." Cinnamon insisted we all pile in the Winnebago, and I was in no mood to argue. I stomped out the fire as quickly as I could while the other two went inside. In the last light of the dying fire, I saw what was making the barking language. It was a dog, or it had a long snout like a dog, but the problem is that dogs don't stand up like people, and this thing was standing up. Suddenly it turned and looked at me and then screamed. I ran toward the trailer, and the thing ran up right behind me. As I grabbed the door, it scratched my back. Screaming in pain, I flung myself inside, and the thing tried to come in after me. Phil fought and kicked at the braying beast until he was able to get the door shut on it. It tried to get in for a while, screaming ridiculously and insanely. Cinnamon was sitting in the corner crying, and I think we all felt like we were going to die. Got quiet outside after a while, and we wondered if the thing had left. Cautiously, I got up off the floor and peeked out the side window. The thing was right there waiting for me. It bellowed again, and then I swear it chest bumped the trailer. It did it again and again. It flung itself at the trailer, banging us with its chest. The thing was so strong, I thought it might actually push us off the road or even knock us over. So I yelled at Cinny to get me the expletive deleted keys, and I drove the HE double hockey sticks out of there. I heard it bark and scream at us one more time before we put some distance between us. Recently I was surfing YouTube and I came upon videos about Dogman. I had no idea that was even a thing. Could that have been the thing that we saw? It had a long snout, 2 pointy ears that stood up, brownish fur, and the most terrifying claws I ever saw on any living creature. I've searched online and found nothing about Dogman appearing in New Jersey, so maybe that isn't what tried to kill us. The only thing I can tell you for sure is that a few months before 9/11, we saw something that shouldn't exist and couldn't possibly be there. And I've never gone out camping again in all these years since. special bonus story never heard before. I accidentally pet a dogman, as told to Peter Bernard, read by PQ Ribber. There's really not much to tell with this story that isn't already in the title. I was out hunting with my Labrador Retriever, Honeybun. Don't let her name fool you. Honeybun is a dangerous creature. I ain't never heard her be scared of nobody or nothing no way no how. I seen her see a bear and point. She never whimpered. She didn't catch a fright from a bobcat, and that was one of the biggest bobcats you can ever imagine coming across. So when I was out with Honeybun that day, and she started getting all whimpery and whinery, at first I got angry like she was being stupid just to annoy me or something. I admit I kind of lost my temperature and said a few things that weren't nice to the poor girl. She just kept whimpering, so I sat down on the ground and called her up alongside of me. Speaking in a soft voice, I apologized for my rude words, and I asked the girl what the nature of the problem was. It was a beautiful day. We was out hunting together. What could be better than this? I patted her next to me for a few seconds. Then I noticed her fur was kind of matted. No wonder she's whining. I've been neglecting her. No hunting dog of mine should have matted hair. Poor Honeybun whined, and who could blame her? Well, it sounded like Honeybun anyway, but it came from behind me. If Honeybun was behind me, who was I petting alongside of me? I swear to you, I had been sitting there, petting some animal's huge, matted, furry foot. Some kind of big clawed foot like I've never seen in my life. I followed that foot on up the leg, up the torso, and it was standing there on two legs. It was a man-like creature, you see. But then whatever it was bent down and roared in my face. It had a dog face or a wolf face, but also kind of like a deer, maybe a horse. I'm not sure because my eyes were shut through part of the scream, and then that thing just up and ran off into the forest faster than anything alive should be able to move. Well, me and Honeybun took off in the opposite direction as that thing, and we probably set some land speed records ourselves that day. It took us a full 3 days to get back to hunting. That's how shook up it got us. But we never seen the monster again, come to think of it. Old Honeybun has never whimpered again since that day. But I tell you what, if she ever does again, man, am I gonna get out of there. Because seeing Dogman once in your life is seeing Dogman one time too many. Don't miss our writer, Peter Bernard, being interviewed on the Exploring the Bizarre radio show on October 12th on KCOR Radio out of Las Vegas. The hosts are Timothy Green Beckley, a.k.a. Mr. UFO, and Emmy winner Tim Swartz, who is also starring in an upcoming History Channel documentary. Peter will be interviewed along with documentary filmmaker Seth Breedlove, director of The Mothman of Point Pleasant, Boggy Creek Monster, and the upcoming Invasion of Chestnut Ridge, due out on October 20th, just in time for Halloween.
Check out the audio podcast version of Scary Stories NYC, now available on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and other popular podcatchers. Bigfoot Attacked My Tiny House. Scary Stories by Peter Bernard, Volume 1, now available on Amazon in paperback, Kindle, and audiobook versions. Narrated by PQ Ribber and me, Madeline Starr.
Forward by TV's famous Timothy Green Beckley, better known as Mr. UFO.
And if there's anyone out there who can't get enough of PQ Ribber, search in your favorite search engine for PQ Ribber, and you'll find plenty of podcasts, music, and weirdness.
Come back for more scary stories.